This is Late Republic Nonsense, this time with Walter Kirn.
Hey, how are you?
I'm terrific. Nice summer day in Montana, and glad to talk to you.
Yeah, I'm kind of jealous that you guys don't have humidity up there. Is there some humidity?
Yeah,
or it's like basically zero.
Yeah, it's low humidity, and you know your potato chips stay good even with the bag open for a month, but that's the upside. It's not so great for the skin and hair and the beauty regimen. Also, this summer we've got a lot of forest fire smoke hanging in the valleys, so I might trade each day.
Have you lived there your whole life?
No, I moved here in 1990 thinking it was going to be part-time from New York City, where I was working in magazines, and I came out here on an assignment to cover an apocalyptic cult that had decided the world was going to end 2 weeks from then, and I was writing for the Village Voice, and I was aware as I reported the story that people were selling their houses for below market in the town of Livingston in anticipation of, Armageddon. And so I bought a house thinking it would be a place I'd retreat to from New York to write. And then after I'd spent 2 months from there, I realized I was idiotic to go back to New York.
Wow.
And
Did you stick with the voice, or you just decided to, that's sort of when you decided to go out on your own?
Well, I kept the place in the city for a couple of years, but the long lines, the bureaucratic hassles of urban life, and the expense were just too much for a young writer who was kind of idealistic and not focused on making money. And so I just stayed.
What were you focused on, if not money? I mean, I know it's kind of a trick question.
Well, this was the early 90s, and I mean it was 1990, and there was still a lot of cultural heat, if you can believe it, around writing short stories and the like. I had heroes like Raymond Carver and
Sure.
Barry Hanna, and I had the same editor that they had, Gordon Lish at Knopf, and Gordon was a great literary Rasputin who could convince you of anything, and he had convinced me that glory in this very small tournament of short story writers was worth anything, and so my metropolitan life in New York had to go.
It's hard not to feel that way when you grow up reading Up Over the Old Hotel and some of those old pieces, especially like there's, and in 1990 in New York it was kind of great. I mean, in many ways it was great for a writer, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it was great for a musician. It was a kind of cultural. It was the beginning of a kind of cultural high point. I mean, the city has had so many, but it was kind of entering a really good period.
I completely agree. Writers at that time even made the gossip pages in the Post, page 6.
No shit.
And you'd find out where Bret Easton Ellis was the night before, or even writers of less headline worthiness. And the city was still inexpensive enough to support the bohemian lifestyle, and how can I say it? Careerism had not yet taken over. A few years later, everybody knew who the other writers' agents were and what their advances were and things like that. But that was uncool and irrelevant at the time I started.
Did you know Nat Antoff? I mean, he was at The Voice forever.
I knew Nat's work. I admired him. I admire him even more now. I mean, the the gadfly civil libertarian seems to be a dying breed. But I had originally started this story about this called out in Montana for Esquire magazine, but they didn't like the first draft. In general, I've had a problem over my magazine career of being sent out to the boondocks to, write about the allegedly ignorant populace, and then coming back with sympathetic portraits of
they don't like that
of the people I'm supposed to deplore. Yeah, and time and time again.
It's a familiar story now. I think you kind of did it before most other folks. I was reading a piece that you did that was so good. Oh, it was written so beautifully in the Atlantic in 2015. And it's really kind of hard to sum up. It's hard to sum up what that thing is about. But most of all, it's kind of like the surveillance state. And you're musing about that topic as you're encountering some of these folks who are who you present sympathetically, if even if you capture their eccentricities.
Yeah, well, yeah, that was a story that compelled me to go in the middle of the night, in the dark of night, in the snow, to the edge of the NSA data center in South Salt Lake City, and I don't know, I walked up to the fence with an ex-military friend so we could at least have an object to ponder in a story that was otherwise a little abstract about surveillance. And then the next day, we passed a gun show just across the valley from that data center, and went in and got a chance to talk to some of the people who were especially concerned and aroused about government overreach, as people at gun shows often are. And I couldn't say I completely disagreed with them, having studied the capabilities of Uncle Sam to reach into our lives, and that story ended up on the cover of the Atlantic. First of all, shocked the hell out of me, but secondly, was to their credit. I don't know that it would be featured so prominently today in our current version of the Atlantic.
Sure. I mean, skepticism of all that is pretty much gone. Of the surveillance state. As many folks have pointed out, the difference between a large company more powerful than most world governments, including our own, and that government itself is almost a distinction without a difference.
The problem for me is that I was raised in probably one of the most liberal states in the country, Minnesota, and I went to public school. I went to public school in the early 70s at a time when all kinds of books about how things might go wrong for liberal society were being pushed on kids, from 1984 to sort of stranger books like Fahrenheit, Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 2000, whatever it is, or 200, whatever it is, and a Canticle for Leibowitz, a post-nuclear fable, and so on. And I had very, sort of anti-war, skeptical teachers who, really preached a kind of wariness about state power. And little did I know that taking those lessons to heart, watching The Crucible and being moved by it, for example, would completely ill-equip me for establishment opinion today.
Right. I played dance force in a crucible in high school, and at first I was because I kind of always had a kind of right wing political bent, and they said, oh, we're doing the crucible, and I was like, oh, it's some commie shit. And the more I look back on it, it's like it's more than prescient. And it's interesting that was, I mean, as you said, that was, you're a little older, but that was part of my curriculum too. That was like the standard curriculum for probably 30 or 40 years prior to, whatever the hell this is.
Yeah. Well, it was only a few years ago that these same agencies, three-letter agencies, and these, war party intellectuals in Washington were being, villainized and vilified by the left. But now the party line changes so quickly, and I guess I decided at some point in life that I had to sort of assemble my principles and stick to them, if only to contribute to the cultural conversation at large in a way I could feel good about. And I just find myself unable to blow within, which just changes almost by the minute now. I'm reading these stories today about the vaccination, great vaccination debate, which need not be a debate really at all, and of the enormity that they made it. And I see 6 months ago members of the current regime saying how they'd never fall for Trump's Operation Warp Speed vaccines, and now they're now they're making them the equivalent of having to wear a flag pin on the right back in the 60s, and having, I think, always been hostile to groupthink, and especially enforced groupthink. I've come out a certain way, and to even name it politically or classify it in traditional right-left terms is something I sometimes resent having to do. I'm like, you guys change that definition every 10 days, and I don't want to have to identify with your latest category for me.
Right. Now here's a kind of stupid basic 101 question, which is that, do you think this is just all a function of technology?
Well, what do you mean by all?
I mean, what the dynamic you just described.
The sort of constant fluctuations and
also the partisanship. I mean, what you described about the vaccine, total, the idea of hypocrisy has gone out the window, and we're in total 100% full tilt partisanship world.
Well, I do attribute a lot of it to technology and to the manipulation of technology. I mean, these power mongers use whatever tool is at hand to achieve their purposes, and social media and internet based distribution of news, etc., has been boon to them. They are able to manipulate social psychological principles or principles of social psychology. Herd instinct, the ability to scapegoat at will, and so on, very adeptly using these new tools, and on a mass scale and an instantaneous timeline. And so it's not so much as I blame the technology as I see the way it has served the purposes all too well. of those who would use the traditional divide and conquer strategies to advance their own interests.
Right. So the more I think about this, the same kind of concept comes up over and over again in different areas for me, which is the concept of scale. And for the last, for as long as I remember, hey, what do you want to do? You want a company? How can it scale? How if I'm doing a task, how can I get this to scale? How can I universalize this? And I think the same thing holds true for the technology and also for the my particular point of view is that this whole large, let's say, I don't want to even it's not even necessarily multi-ethnic as much as it is multi-ideological state with 300 million people is just too big. It's more like, the Roman Empire than it is, a coherent state with a coherent state with a, common culture and a common language and, a shared history and some affection for one another.
Okay. I will credit that model. It does seem to explain a lot, but just for the sake of argument, I sometimes wonder if the problem isn't that we're too unified, in this sense, that that there used to exist true regional differences, true ethnic and cultural differences that were hard to bring together and had to be considered when forming coalitions and so on. What social media seems to have done is to create at least a superficial conglomerate that can be moved at once and as though it had no conflicting interests or makeup. And so you're able to start these wildfire panics and these crusades, the current one being this against the unvaccinated, quote unquote, with a kind of sweeping, homogenous effect that just was not possible in the old days because people didn't speak each other's languages. In some ways, the country, when it was more fractured and more locally based, was harder to move like a big as they can,
sure.
It seems, today. Sometimes I wonder if by sacrificing our multipolar, far-flung and internally conflicted nature, we've gotten this blob monster that can, through basic interventions involving fear and distrust and anger, be made to do these colossally bad things.
Right.
It's funny because I used to know Peter Fonda, and Peter always held out that he was the genius behind that movie, and Dennis Hopper always claimed to be too. And there was a lot of internecine Hollywood arguments over who created the story and who was the sort of spiritual author of that book. Of that movie. But you're right. It's a movie about leaving Southern California wherever they set out.
Either of them. It's probably Steppenwolf.
What's that?
It's probably Steppenwolf. The band.
Your voice is breaking up.
With the song. Can you hear me now? Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. No. I was going to say it was probably Steppenwolf. That had the song.
Right.
Song from, right. And Nicholson too.
Yeah, and it had that enigmatic, ending, we blew it, and it was never specific about what was blown exactly. But one thing you might imagine they blew was that they were arrogant. That they thought themselves they were really in a sort of bubble of countercultural certainty, and they forgot about the real world. And in some ways, the movie's kind of relevant to today because there is a continuing war on the so-called redneck and provincial attitude that's holding us back from, homo global consensus. So I can actually see a movie that anathematized the small town being popular again.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. I don't pay attention to what's made in Hollywood. Though I just recently, in the last couple of weeks, I actually rewatched the film that you wrote, Up in the Air.
Yeah.
And, I mean, sure, as every writer that I've spoken to who's had either a film adapted or has written a screenplay or something, it's always like, they're always thinking about the compromises that went into the final product. But if you're not aware of all that, it's such a great film. I mean, the dialogue is wonderful. I have not actually read the book yet, but I plan to.
The book is. Well, first of all, there were other writers involved of the screenplay.
Sure.
My original screenplay for the movie was not used as it should have been, I believe. But the book is a much more almost nihilistic vision of technology and isolation. It's really a book set at the turn of the century about a descent into sort of technological paralysis. It's a theme that's not really carried out well in the movie, but the book was about a kind of decimation of American place, the way everything was just melting into one big airport, and the Clooney character, who I never imagined when I wrote the book would be so good looking and dashing, was in the book. I mean, to be a bit of a spoiler, dying, and was sort of on his last legs, and Hollywood's magic is such that you think that they're going to destroy your work by putting a George Clooney, say, in the lead. But if he does the job correctly, he transforms the whole thing into a vehicle for himself. And he did that successfully in that movie.
Right. No, I always think of, one of the big differences between American films and French films is that the main male actors in French films are just not, they're not particularly attractive.
Except for Alain Delon.
or dashing. Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you've got a couple exceptions, and then of course you Belmondo and folks like that who sort of like redefine. They have that kind of rugged thing going on, but just in general, usually it's the women that are knockouts in French films, and it's the guy is more average. Let's say where in American films everyone is like
It's true. I mean, I got to be present for a lot of the filming of that movie and see how Clooney, who really was in every scene just about, worked his magic. And I've got to say, I've been around a lot of sets, and I've been around some TV shows and so on, but I've never seen a guy bend a film project to his own personality like I did Clooney. I mean, this was a movie that was really about a loser in some ways, a loser and a chump who had been seduced into a meaningless lifestyle by the seduction of frequent flyer miles and airline loyalty privileges, and yet he made it this sort of bittersweet, anti-heroic hymn to kind of doomed American freedom, and it was amazing to watch.
Yeah, and just it kind of reminds me of like his performance in there. Kind of reminds me of he's a door-to-door salesman. It's like the antithesis of the old the old documentary salesman, which is a lot more gritty and beaten down.
If in the writing of the book I had any actual classic literary inspiration, it was Death of a Salesman. I grew up in a really small town in Minnesota with minimal exposure to high art, as it were, and I'm really a product of that public high school curriculum in some ways. And I remember reading Death of a Salesman and just being floored. I'd never been exposed to that kind of pessimism. I think I grew up equating pessimism with high art. And
right.
When I wrote that novel, that mood of sort of empty, all-American existential dread was really upon me, and I got cross addicted as a kid, because even though that kind of art, we did mention two Arthur Miller plays, The Crucible and Death of a Salesman here, even though that kind of art is maybe a downer to most people, I found it exhilarating.
I did too, actually. I did too. Yeah.
Why do you think?
Oh man, I don't really know. I mean, I guess in the same way that I found Ingmar Bergman kind of exhilarating in some way. Maybe it's because like you. I mean, I grew up without the art thing in my home. I had to go seek it out, and partly when you're, first starting on the road to seeking it out, you're encountering all these things that are just the opposite of the opposite of your expectations and your experience. And maybe, I find that though I find that as time goes on, maybe I'm, I can deal with less of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, life hands you enough tragedy to slake your appetite for bonus tragedy.
Exactly. And there's this dynamic, slightly related, but there's this dynamic that I found. I used to, when I was going through that period, I was very much into film noir. And I was in high school, and I was just going, and you could rent 5 movies for 5 days, and I would just go into the classic movie section, see a cover with a guy in a trench coat and a fedora, and was like, okay, I'll get that. And I just went through so many of these, and I'm watching these films, and it's like, the tragedy is. The drama and the tragedy is like pitched to 11, and occasionally I would remember, I think the first time I had a buddy I was talking to about some of these things, and was, you got like whatever, let's watch The Big Sleep or something, And we watch The Big Sleep, and if you're watching it alone, it's a tragedy. If you're watching it with one other person, it becomes a comedy. And it's things that I don't understand because it's so over the top that you like it. You just kind of have to laugh, and you laugh at all the all the conventions, all the kind of stock drama things that are associated with with noir or any kind of dramatic genre like that. It just turns into a comedy, so that like you'll go and you'll see the Maltese Falcon on the big screen, and you're sitting next to 100 other people, and everybody's laughing. And and this is something you're weird.
I'm a fellow noir fan, and obsessive even, and for a long time, one of my closest pals was James Ellroy, the novelist.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
We used to hang out endlessly in Los Angeles a few years ago. James is the kind of guy who has like one friend at a time, and I was filling that slot. And he's a real student and learned student of noir. He can trace every shot back to some German expressionist classic, or he knows what's going on there, and he sort of was my tutor in it after I'd already seen a lot of the movies, but he made me conscious of them.
It was like graduate school.
Yeah, it was like graduate school. He made a strong case that the best noir film was Out of the Past with Robert Mitchum. He felt that it handled the essential male-female drama better than any other. And I also was a fan in literature of the so-called hard-boiled novels of people like Jim Thompson, and I think I enjoy those movies comically and for their tropes and for their conventions now in a much more lighthearted way than I used to. Like you, they used to really engross me and sort of depress me, and I was also very susceptible to their pretty much left-wing critique of American power. I mean, you can't separate noir, and especially the hard-boiled novel, from a sort of Depression era anger at the big organizations that serve the capitalists,
and the rich guy pulling strings in town, et cetera. Right.
I mean, every noir, James thought the femme fatale and so on was at the heart of it. I always thought it was the feeling that you're just a cog in a corrupt system, and that ultimately crime doesn't pay because the bigger criminals are all above you. And not only does crime not pay, but investigation doesn't pay, because at the end of the day, you're going to find out you're part of a machine you can't escape. And I just watched the movie Blade Runner for the first time last night, which was, which is really a noir updated or cast into the future, and it's the same story. Harrison Ford sets out on a isolated mission to do, to get rid of some bad actors, and finds out in the end that he's part of sort of morally corrupt, even sort of sinful, larger endeavor to, enslave these new robot people, so that. But I got to say that noir picture of the social and commercial and power structures of the country is coming back to me now as I live day to day. I mean, I can't help but see some of these public health officials who, on the one hand, are feeding money to China to do some unholy viral research, and on the other hand, acting like sainted guides to, our common welfare as noir villains. I mean, Fauci seems like he would be a perfect noir villain. And so, the genre continues to hold relevance for me.
Yeah. I want to ask you about David Goodis, if you read his stuff.
Okay, you'll have to. I have. Is that the Burnt Orange Heresy?
He wrote Shoot the Piano Player.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, which was turned into one of my favorite films by Truffaut.
It was, as I remember, it had a different name as a book.
Yeah. Trying to remember what it's called. I've got it around here somewhere. But they've re-released. They re-released it as Shoot the Piano Player. God, what was it called? Yeah. But it was fantastic, and the way Truffaut, the way he played with that particular source material was just incredible, because he kind of cranked up the comedy aspect.
In general, I feel like the French are doing the job of archiving and keeping alive the best of American culture, and they have been for a long time. I watch them streets right now, and I see them as, the American timeline I wish we were still on. I mean,
you mean the protest?
Yeah. I'm like, maybe America was always just a projection of the French imagination. We aren't really who we think we are, and the French have mistaken us for something that they are and have projected onto a screen.
I think there's a lot to that, because it happens in art all the time.
Yeah.
It happens in art all the time, like old westerns, Kurosawa into spaghetti westerns, back to Kurosawa, our when we think of God, I hate to sound like a lefty here, but when you think of the other, the cultural other, in your creative work, one ends up influencing the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I worry that we've failed others' imagining of us in this country, because right now, I mean, going back to Noir, the character of the lonely, conscientious investigator who, looks under the superficial poses and postures of power is suspect in America. I mean, asking questions, being sort of cynically skeptical of the pronouncements of the big shots is suddenly a dubious way to be. And I'm thinking, wait, we invented this and we're going to abandon it? The rest of the world, the rest of the world expects it from us, and we're not even into it anymore.
And the speed with which we abandoned it is really quite something. I mean, this is why a lot of this shit to me is a little freaky. For more reasons than this, but it's one reason, which is how fast things can turn on a dime. I mean, remember a few years ago, we had just been through, 80 years of Democrats being, let's say, soft on Russia.
Yeah.
Throughout the Cold War, and the Obama years, we were arguing about this with the New START treaty and all this stuff, and yes, we've got to do a Russian reset and everything's great and yada yada, and they just go right on a dime to
Well, I mean, I totally agree. It speaks to the absolute capture of the mainstream media by partisan interests and intelligence organizations and so on. But the creation of Putin's supervillain and a kind of new paranoia about Russia was just amazing, and they seem, I don't know what the status of it is today. It seems like just yesterday we excused cyber intrusions by the Chinese that had they been attributable to Russia, Newsweek would have run cover stories on us, avenging. It's really as though anything can be turned into a crusade or a scare or
right.
A panic now, and watching people respond to it. And you see, this is where Twitter is so misleading. 3/4 of the people who go along with these things don't even exist. If you're to dig down into their profiles, they either are fictional or partisan. And I know that in the case of COVID, they've actually devised schemes of micropayments to all kinds of people who are on social media to just toe the line. But the ability to engineer these and get them going, these sort of giant flash mobs is one thing, but the ability to make us forget that we were just the other day doing the opposite is even more astonishing. It is just a constant erasure and substitution. And in Orwell in 1984, that process is very arduous. Winston Smith has to go to this big room full of drudgy clerks and stick things into the memory hole where they're burnt and read papers and excise bad photos and bad headlines. And now it's just plug and play. Memory holing is a continual, seamless, automated process. They don't have
really
any
takes no effort. That's the thing that makes me kind of crazy and fearful, which is that this thing takes no effort. And once I saw that with Russia, I thought immediately that they could turn on a dime on anything. If they can throw away nearly a century of their Russia policy, and do a 180, they could do anything. And I think sure, they want to shut down alternate sources of information or alternate conduits, things like that. But in a way, they don't really even have to, because you just the example you just gave of the Chinese cyber warfare. Had it been Russia, it would have been a different thing. We have the information. We can sit and make a statement like that and a comparison and talk about it. But people don't give a shit.
Well, okay, so growing up in Minnesota, I was hyper aware of two native son writers, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Sinclair Lewis. And even though
Bob Dylan.
Well, that's number 3, yes.
Right.
All 3, well, no, except for Fitzgerald, 2 Nobel Prize winners and 1 great novelist. But in any case, Lewis always held that America was a place of mindless conformity. That was his critique of the small town in our town, of the business community in Babbitt, and so on. And maybe he was right in some respect. we just want to get along. And Arthur Miller said the same thing. It was getting people to like you was the key to life, according to Willy Loman, who, of course, we were supposed to see as tragically wrong, but and mistaken. But in any case, these writers all pointed to the fact that Americans liked to move with the herd in an optimistic or forward-looking fashion, and they may just be being proved right again and again by what's going on, because staying with the crowd, the Chamber of Commerce, the people at work seems, if anything, more important now. And then there was, this counter narrative that's held up by Noir and other cultural products, that the real American is the cowboy, the skeptic, the loner, the rebel. And that seems to have been a romantic illusion, all things considered.
Yeah, I mean, though, was it an illusion, or is it just something that has disappeared? I mean, I guess it's the same thing.
David, it may have disappeared, but I also have a strange notion that it exists just under the surface. That people feel economically vulnerable. The middle class has shrunk inestimably in size and in confidence and in self-confidence, and so the luxury or the ability to be critical, skeptical, against the grain has incurred more risks. But I like to think that the soul of the place hasn't changed that much, and that there are all these munchkins who are scared of the witches, hiding under their flower pots, who are ready to emerge at the right moment. Now, that could be just wishful thinking, but one's real conversations, and I travel around a lot by car, and I talk to everybody. I'm one of those, people who talks to their seatmate on a plane. That tells me that there's a lot of what they call preference falsification going on in culture right now. That people aren't really tipping their hands. That there's a hell of a lot more skepticism, even outright hostility to the approved narratives that we're allowed to see. And I mean, it's certainly true that Twitter and these other social media companies are showing a real insecure defensive streak in the constant and increasing efforts they're making to shut people up. So they're afraid of something, and that something is I think a skepticism that I see and hear all the time on the ground. I just don't see reflected in the media stream.
Right. Well, I think they're clamping down because they kind of believe what they've been telling themselves, which is that for the last, 10 years or so, really in the last 5, you've had an entire industry built up in, think tankville. That think tankville everywhere from Washington D.C. to the in-house think tanks at Google and Facebook and wherever, and their main message is that it's basically a couple videos, and snap, someone turns into an extremist. And since they have no helpful way of defining what extremism is, that's at all reasonable. They really think that if you're exposed to something, boom, you're gone.
If they're authentically afraid of what they call extremism, what they've held extremism to be, then they're insane. Because I've lived in a state for 30 years, Montana, which going back to the 90s was held to be the mythical home of the patriot movement, they used to call it, the militia movement, this and that movement were, supposedly responsible for things like the Oklahoma City bombing and so on. And it has been absurdly and laughably overplayed in the media. I mean, I guess they need a villain, but if they knew the nature of the real dissidents that they were vilifying, they'd be ashamed of themselves. Maybe 10 guys in a Holiday Inn every once in a while, or at a sad gun show counter handing out pamphlets. And I have seen no upsurge in the violence or vehemence of those people. A lot of those people, of course, if they are radicalized, it was usually by participating in the U.S. military, which is a organization which leaves people really wondering if power ever tells them the truth. But in any case, I can't believe they think Emmanuel Goldstein is as powerful as they say. I think it's a crock. I really do. Now, if they're fearing populist resentment of the kind that is breaking out all over the world, it's convenient for them to demonize it the way they have, and it's probably rational for them to fear it, because they have done a terrible job of cutting in their populations on their trade deals and their international treaties and globalist utopian schemes, and so they're probably right to think that they've triggered a lot of hostility, but to frame it as some sort of second coming of night riding Klan activity is, I think, disingenuous.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's disingenuous too, and yet they seem to believe it. I mean, I've encountered these people, especially the academic types, who really seem to believe it, and though in a way they're not, when their ideology leads them to this place, which is that anyone who is a dissident from, let's say, the accepted narrative today that we want,
I have a good friend back east, very well educated. I went to Princeton, somebody I knew there, who was telling me last fall about pickup truck people. And I was like, who are they? And he was, the pickup truck people. And they are, that was shorthand for some kind of, tide of insurrectionists. And I went, this is sad, man. You'd buy a pickup truck too if you lived in Montana. If you had to,
of course,
if you had to haul stuff from Costco to some cabin, if you were a tradesperson. I mean, it's so classist, it's disgusting. Most of this, fear of the populist nationalist right or whatever is just classism disguised as something noble, because really what they can't stand are plumbers, people who are in the military, who went to Votech or to colleges not quite up to snuff, and they dress this classic contempt and snobbery in this virtuous garb of protecting our democracy.
Right.
But in any case, I will admit that friends I know who are in the sort of particle accelerators of New York City and Washington and so on become convinced that all kinds of boogeymen exist that just don't. I mean, they it's in their interest to think so. It sort of affirms their decision to live where they live. they're people who don't get out a lot. Finally, they're very consumed by their careers and with their status ambitions within an in-group, and so they start, like most courts, most royal courts, to become paranoid about the peasantry.
Sure.
And they remind me of people in Graham Greene novels who are in some provincial capital, subject to all sorts of weird fears and suspicions about what might be bubbling up in the countryside.
Right. No, I mean, there's that for sure. And the people who kind of create the work product for them to consume are folks who, I encountered when I lived in and worked in DC for a long time, which is that, if you are, let's say, you are a Russia person, you are someone that deals with Russia. Of course, you're going to make them out. There's a natural instinct to make them out to be 10 feet tall, even subconsciously, so that you can justify your paycheck, so that you can say that or think of yourself as doing something important. And if
you're a public
enemy
health,
is always the worst enemy.
If you're a public health person or epidemiologist or so on, then the greatest threat of mankind's history is the current respiratory virus. But we used to have a class of people, maybe you could call them intellectuals, public intellectuals, I don't know, artists, Harriet, that knew this principle of sort of bureaucratic narcissism and discounted for it. And now instead they act as an accelerant for these delusions.
What do you think is the responsibility of the artist? Does that exist?
I don't like to swear. I spent time as a Mormon when I was a kid, but I think it's to say "fuck you" first of all, just as a matter of policy, and then to use that as a sort of space clearing technique to present their eccentric, strange, multifaceted visions of life. But the first responsibility of the artist is to clear space for art, and they're failing in that respect. The encroachments of official. What's that?
What does that mean, like clear space for art?
You clear space for art by asserting that there is some territory not governed by official narratives, not susceptible to the dictates of power, that is none of their business, that they're ignorant about probably, and that in the name of simple freedom, liberty, or imaginative potency, you get to rule. So, in other words, as politics and not just politics, because politics widely defined is just sort of the study of society and power, and that's a pretty basic preoccupation of mankind. But as partisan politics, as party politics, and power politics claims every space from sports to TV comedy to what you can say on campus, it has also claimed for itself the domain of art. And artists have done a terrible job of saying, no, this is our playground. No, this is our studio. This is our universe. They've let these people dictate their themes, tell them which villains are now out of favor and which ones they can use. They've they've saturated the art space with their demands, their themes, and their agendas. And mostly they have claimed the right to censor all sorts of statements and beliefs. And it's happened in the creative space, not just the current event space. And artists have just sat down and taken it in a way that I really am shocked by, because when the regular population who's worried about their jobs, goes along with the latest party line, that's one thing. But when artists whose job is to create from the conscience and the imagination, not the memo that they're getting, when they fall down on the job, it's truly demoralizing.
Right. No, I agree with you. I think a lot about beauty as a as sort of something to strive for, even if you're covering or dealing with things that are not inherently beautiful, or even or even kind of very ugly. And sort of within that, I think a lot about the sort of the process of an artist finding their voice, and specifically cultivating it. And that's something that you've done. Your voice is, I mean, I don't know. I love how you write in a way that that is it's actually beautiful in a way that a lot of other people out there who are writing are not concerned with. And so how does your how does your method work? Like how did you go about finding that particular voice? And the really important thing to me is like when you say no, I'm going in a direction that's not good, and then you sort of reorient.
Well,
what does that process look like?
Well, first of all, any voyage of self-discovery in art is a voyage away from voices that would tell you how to do things, tell you you're doing them wrong. It's a voyage away from self-censorship to a real discovery of what gives you pleasure yourself, mentally, intellectually, aesthetically. First thing you got to know is what you like, and what you like as yourself, not because you're told to, expected to, or think it would be cool to say so. And so the tuning fork, the inner tuning fork, that has to be in a way pristine for you to I think be charismatic in your art, and meaning you have to be responding to really almost puritanically to a inner set of standards, values, works of art that have moved you, and so on, to really be yourself. And in an era of censorship and party line rhetoric that infects the arts, it's very hard to find out what you innocently find beautiful in yourself. You always have an editor shoulder as a writer, and if that editor is someone other than you, other than your highest sort of synthesis of your greatest models and so on, you're lost. You're in a spiral. And so for me, that's all very abstract sounding. But for me, it's does this feel like something I would be excited to read? And is this something that sounds like music to my ears? To me, artists to me, artists are heroes of the spirit. It's not their work that's really important. If you're a Mark Twain fan, it's not so much the individual works of Mark Twain that move you. If you're enough of one, you'll read anything by him. And it's to be in his company that you really go to him for. It's to feel the spirit, to feel the independence, the mischief, the sort of regional intonations used by what was in fact a very canny Victorian intellectual, and so what people are really looking for from art and artists that I don't think they realize are not masterpieces or even particular works, but a spiritual vibration.
Right. It's funny to say that. That's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah.
How do you keep from being self-indulgent?
Well, in my case, having grown up in the great American Midwest, where self-indulgence is basically the original sin, it's easy.
Right.
My problem is not being able to be self-indulgent. Sometimes I'm cripplingly self-conscious. If I have a fault as a writer, it's that I don't write enough. It's that I don't write easily enough, because that voice of the Midwest, who are you to say this? You should be spending your time on something more practical. Et cetera, are always in my ears. I really envy writers and artists who grew up with a genuine bohemian environment, because they have been given permission in advance to pour themselves into art, whereas I seem to have to re-credential myself every time I sit down at the...
Right, you got to look both ways. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I get that too, and I also have a bit of envy, for those people, and I think a lot about when I think of like the kind of perfect artist. Thelonious Monk always comes into my head, because he was able to create. I mean, as you said, like people will argue about masterpieces. But I think that's a less important conversation, as you said, than the idea that, you hear Monk's music and immediately you're in his universe.
Yes.
And he's got.
No. And the great jazz artists, probably to me, are the greatest American artists of any kind in some ways. And I think a lot of our writers, certainly Jack Kerouac and people like that would agree. But it's because they have developed a way of hearing themselves and a way of and a confidence in their own intuition. I mean, what's jazz but intuition? Laid over incredible, instrumental skill to bring that intuition to fruition, and I would when I was young and I would see jazz artists on TV sometimes, or in the ways I would have to see them living in a Minnesota town, I went, wow, these guys are in their own world in a way nobody else gets to be. And in that world, they know more about what they're doing than anyone else could. And why is it so magnetic to watch them? I mean, in Minnesota, maybe that a certain kind of contemporary jazz was probably condemned as being similarly nonsensical to abstract expressionist art, say. There was a lot of, my kid could make that. It's finger painting, and so on. And I think there was a feeling about a lot of jazz that was similar when it was heard on soundtracks or whatever. But I was galvanized by those performers and those performances and the actual records when I was able to hear them. And then finally the few live performances I was able to get to once I left home, because I went, man, to be that sure of yourself in a universe whose rules you yourself have defined is a kind of freedom that is next to divine, you know.
No, that's a beautiful way to put it, and I think about it that way as well. Did you, when you were living in New York, did you go see a lot of music?
I saw some, you know. I didn't have much money, and I didn't have much literacy about what to go see. New York of the late 80s, when I was there, was a downtown sort of scene. It was dominated by a certain kind of music that maybe you see at CBGBs or something like that. I didn't have the taste to go to the right jazz clubs and see the legends in their last hurrahs, kind of.
Right, but in the downtown, I mean, that was the scene that I was participating in the late '90s. So, kind of 10 years later, you know, at a lot of the same clubs, like the Knitting Factory and
yes,
and the other stuff down the line, and it was still, I mean, even in the late '90s, it was just an electric place to be. 10 years later, because in the late '80s is when that stuff started to first bubble up. And you know, throughout the '90s, it actually first started as a kind of rock, where they were trying to figure out how to deal with the world of rock music, and then it moved over into a more kind of classically jazz scenario. And there was so much. Yeah, I mean, I think about that time a lot because it was the thing that drew me initially to New York. And you know, and it was exciting, and I wanted to be a part of it because there was you know, there was a palpable sense that there were people who were sort of on that journey in the way that you described about, you know, jazz musicians, but artists more generally.
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of poets and I mean, I didn't know any short story writers at the time. I wish I did.
Well, you know,
maybe they all moved to the Midwest.
The short story sort of, for various reasons, had a peak, I think, in the 80s and early 90s, because it was still published in a lot of different interesting places. And, you know, like anything, music and art scenes are kind of mysteries. You know, why did grunge rock, as it were, flower in the Seattle area when it did? Why did beat poetry all spring up around San Francisco at a certain time? You know, it's really because it's a social contagion, art. You know, that the you don't necessarily get the greatest minds. You get the ones that are hanging out together and infecting each other and sort of turbocharging each other's sense of possibility. And so you get these pods, and the pods that have existed in New York and the history of them is the cultural history of the city. And I, in a way, left there in the early 90s when a certain kind of literary product was highly esteemed. And then I got back when I started to really get back in the 2000s, and it had all disappeared. You know, it was like it had just moved on. Somehow the spirit had left the body.
Right. You know, but that happens. That's and it's funny the way you said it. It's not necessarily the smartest or most brilliant, but maybe you could say it's the most social, or most socially. I mean, saying the most social makes it sound that it's all about, you know, the hang, and it's all about people, you know, just you know, drinking and smoking and hanging out. But
it really is,
there's
man.
A lot of that too.
You know, to a huge extent, because the myth of the romantic lone genius in art obscures the fact that three people hanging out can do things that one person with their genius can never do. And it's sort of mysterious why that is. I'm sure it could be analyzed and all kinds of hypotheses could be made. But when groups of friends come together, like Allen Ginsberg's friends, I mean, he started a publishing company, or Ferlinghetti did, to publish a bunch of guys who, I don't know, they probably belonged in the Salvation Army, getting alcoholism treatment, but were able for a few years there to produce an enduring body of work. It's one of the arguments for the divine in art, because it really can't be reduced. When the spirit is on a place and a set of people and a scene, it is. And when it is gone, they can all have degrees from the best places and have MFAs and all sorts of things, but they can't will it.
Right. Yeah. No, it's true. And I don't know if I've said this a lot. If I have any talent whatsoever that whatever I was born with that I just have, it's for figuring out when the energy is gone from a place. And it's time to move on. And I've done it like in a couple of different ways. I'll just wake up in the morning and say it's over. And, and like sometimes you can leave right away. Sometimes in San Francisco in the mid 2000s, I woke up one day. I said, it's like this feels like it's going to go on the downswing. And within 24 hours, I left the city. And
David, I would assert that there are two skills there, one for detecting it and the other for acting on the discovery. A lot of a lot of people hang around long after the thrill is gone culturally, and it does move around the country. I hope it's somewhere at all times in the country. Sometimes, of course, my biggest fear is that it will flee our shores entirely. That we're giving no quarter to the weirdos and nonconformists. And as someone who I guess others probably perceive as a conservative, or someone right-wing tendencies, I always feel strange being a passionate defender of that nonconformist, spirited, artistic impulse. Isn't this your job? I think about so-called progressives. My problem with progressives now is that they seem to have subordinated all other values to the advancement of the Hegelian state or something. They've left the lonely rest of us, artists included, sort of out of the equation.
I never thought of that. I mean, you mentioning Hegel, and I think of the concept of history and the progression of history. Implicit in progressivism is the idea of that march. And I guess maybe it's possible. I haven't thought this through, but maybe it's possible that if you embrace that, you give up a lot of what makes art really possible. You give up a lot of what makes imagination really possible.
You do, and I always think about the writer Isaac Babel. I don't know how to pronounce it. Babel. Yeah. Here he is, short story writer, who he's down with the Russian Revolution. He's got no problem with it. But he has some problems with it, and he stops producing. And the Soviet state decides that his silence signals lack enthusiasm. And merely for not being as productive as he was before, the regime kills him, locks him up and kills him because he had stopped serving the cause. And, he wasn't opposing it. He just wasn't loud enough in its defense or its, celebration. And to me, that's the real of many authoritarian cautionary tales about the artist, the definitive one, because you got to be useful. The machine as it has identified itself has a goal. It has a production schedule. It wants utopia by this date, or at least to show this level of progress toward its creation. And artists and other kind of thinkers are just not used to the regimentation and the utilitarian equations that go with that kind of political state ambition, and so they're doomed to be left out. They're doomed to be considered enemies and or insane, useless parasites on society. And it's in defense of that group. It's in defense of the weirdos that I really am probably more conservative than I used to be, because strangely they don't seem to be in favor with those who are trying to fashion this new world.
Right. I agree. Hey, this has been really beautiful. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, David, it's my privilege. I don't get to talk or think this way all the time.
I hope we can do it again. I hope we can figure something out where we can do it again. We can do it on video. But I kind of like this kind of just walking around. I mean, I've probably done 50 laps around my apartment, just kind of thinking and listening and chatting. So this has been great.
Well, okay, anytime. And you, if there's some subject that you think, now having seen the menu kind of my free associating mind, would be especially good for us to talk about, you just let me know. It's
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. All right. Have a good one.
I'll talk to you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.